Welcome back to Solving Basketball. This is Jordan Sperber. And before we get into the episode, it is our first one in a while, and I just have a couple quick housekeeping items that I want to mention. First off, I recorded this episode with Jonathan Safir and Ken Pomeroy, and we did it via a Zoom call, which in the past, Solving Basketball has gone up on YouTube in addition to the different podcast apps, but the YouTube version has just been audio. No extra video up on the old episodes. This is the first episode that does have video. Really, the reason why I didn't do it in the past is that getting coaches and finding a good time to schedule, to have guests on, it's kind of hard enough in it of itself. And it was just easier to do phone calls. But right now, with how popular Zoom is, things have changed a little bit. So I might keep doing this going forward. I won't commit to it. But for this episode, you can go watch on YouTube and see the video component, our faces. And also I did at certain points add some context to what we were talking about with graphs, referring to the graphs that we were talking about. You might have already seen their new article on kenpom.com this week, but the reason I had Ken and Jonathan on and back on, they're actually repeat Solving Basketball guests, is because they recently published an article about intentionally fouling. So not just fouling up three, which is something that Ken has looked at in the past, but this article was about fouling up two, up one, and tied. And really, it's, I think, the first original research on some of these topics. And so I had them on to go over that information and the data, but also they have different perspectives, with Jonathan being in coaching. He's the director of basketball operations for San Francisco. And then, of course, Ken's data and predictive analytics background. We obviously talked about the data and the findings in this new article, and I definitely recommend pulling up kenpom.com and checking it out even before the episode for full context. And we also gave our opinions and speculated a little bit at the end over just how serious coaches might take this, if we should expect to see it as soon as next year or just in the future with new coaches and staffs trying to implement it. Then at the very end of the episode, I did switch gears because it was Ken on, and this is something that I've really wanted to ask him about, where hypothetically, and I have no inside information here, but if there was no non-conference this season, in college basketball, how that would affect his predictive rankings. He gave insight on that. And then also from an NCAA selection committee perspective, how no non-conference game would affect that process. The last thing I want to mention is this past Sunday, I put out a newsletter on the business side of Hoop Vision. It goes pretty into detail on what we've learned over the last 2 years doing Hoop Vision and trying to make money off of a college basketball media business and our goals going forward. One of the things mentioned in that newsletter is this week, if you sign up for an annual subscription to Hoop Vision Plus, which is $100 for the year, we're sending out subscribers a Hoop Vision t-shirt. It's dry fit, pretty nice shirt. Jonathan was actually wearing it during the podcast. So if you're listening on YouTube, you can see it in action there. But for anyone who subscribes this week, we're sending out that t-shirt. And again, the newsletter kind of covers our goals with Hoop Vision Plus, how it's been going, and where we're going from here. Thank you very much for listening to the podcast, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
What is basketball? What is this basketball? Is that basketball? What is basketball?
I am now joined by two guests who are making their second Solving Basketball appearances, Jonathan Safir and Ken Pomeroy. Thank you both for coming back on.
Hey, Jordan. Nice to be here.
What's up, Jordan? Thanks for having us.
So we've already done the free throws out of 100 with both of you, and I'm going to make our listeners go re-listen to those episodes if they want to know how many free throws you guys would make out of 100. But I feel like the appropriate first question here instead is to ask about curling, Ken, and if you've taken over that industry yet.
No, I haven't taken it over yet, but I've actually gotten a lot of good feedback from it. I mean, like basketball, it's the off season for curling. So, and it's obviously dealing with the same situation with COVID. So there's it's not the peak time of year for it, but I've been kind of encouraged by people that have responded to the early attempts at curling analytics.
Is it like at first with your stuff, it wasn't necessarily prevalent among coaches. Now it really is, obviously. So is it different in terms of like barrier of entry? And I don't even really know. Are there coaches in curling? Or
there are, but it's really a player-based sport. Like the coaches are, for most teams, an afterthought if they even have them. Some teams don't have coaches. So it's like really similar to when I started in basketball, because I'm a total outsider. I don't really have any connections in the sport. I do have I guess a little bit of like name recognition just because of the basketball stuff, but I don't, I'm an outsider and there hasn't been a lot of work done in the field. So a lot of stuff is fresh and I'm just like discovering things and probably saying a lot of stupid stuff that I'll regret in 15 years, but it's pretty fun right now.
Cool. Well, I told you this off camera, but I have read all the blog posts. I don't know if I'm going to be a long-term reader, but I've liked it so far for sure.
That's encouraging.
So I had you guys both on. You just released a study on intentional fouling, not fouling up three this time, but almost everything else besides fouling up three. And Solving Basketball listeners know we had Todd Golden, the head coach of San Francisco, on talking about some of this foul up two stuff. But I want to start with Jonathan on this. The fouling up two against BYU last year was what inspired some of this work. So can you just walk us through that situation again to refresh everyone on what you guys did in that game?
Sure. So we were playing BYU at home, who I believe at the time was right around the 10th best team in Ken's rankings, and even better offensively. I think they finished the year, they're like third. They're ridiculous offensively. And there was 20 seconds left or thereabouts. We were up by 2. BYU had the ball, and they just called timeout. And at that point in the season, they were the best three-point shooting team in the country, and they were shooting like at that game. They were north of 50%. I think they were 14 of 26 at the time. So obviously, the tail risk of them making a three either at the buzzer or in that possession is real and live. And when they call timeout, one of their best players, Yoli Childs, to date on the season, I believe was right around 60%, and was actually coming off a wrist or hand injury. So that probably also hurt his percentages. And we were in the single bonus. And we talked as a staff previously and had done some unique and implementations of foul strategies, such as end of the half against Pacific, to try and gain extra possessions or incremental advantages here or there. And at the timeout, I just went up to Coach Golden, and said, I think we should follow Yoli, because the odds are he's probably going to touch the ball either early in the possession or whatever, at some point in the possession. Coach thought about it for a split second, and true to how he is and the brilliant mind he is, and he deserves all the credit, he said, "You're right, let's do it." And just went right and just walked over the team in the huddle and said, "Here's what we're going to do. As soon as Yoli Childs gets the ball, we're going to foul him. And we're going to live with the results. We're either going to be up 2 with the ball, up 1, or tied. And as the worst case scenario is we're free rolling. We have a chance to win the game in regulation, and worst case scenario is overtime. We take away the tail risk of losing." Sure enough, they inbound the sideline out of bounds. Yoli gets the ball right away. They inbound it right to Yoli. We foul him right away. Yoli goes to the line, misses the first. We get fouled. We get the rebound, get fouled, make both. They went down and actually made a 3, I believe, and we played the foul game a little bit, but ended up winning by 1. They made a 3 at the buzzer, take it from 4-1. But an additional thing in that decision-making, in that split-second decision-making, was the fact that BYU was not a great offensive rebounding team. That was not one of their strengths. And not only were they not a great offensive rebounding team, but we were taking their best offensive rebounder and their biggest presence, if we fouled him, off the block and shooting the free throw, and which means he's probably going to get the rebound at a less rate than if he was not the shooter. All that kind of factored into a split-second decision where Coach Golden deserves all the credit. He obviously is the head coach who gets the shine when it goes right. Thankfully it did, or has to answer questions when it goes awry. So that was kind of.
Well, that was something I talked about with him on that first podcast, is that for decisions like this that are very counterintuitive, as like the support staffer or the analytics guy or whatever it is on the bench, you might not have the incentives to do the best win probability thing. It might just be to kind of cover yourself so that you don't, like, the way I would have looked at it when I was working for teams was, I don't want to be the reason why we lost a game, more so than trying to maximize win probability. And that's where Todd having an understanding of expected value and being process oriented really helps, right?
Oh, for sure. And he's awesome at that. I think he has an unbelievable knack and intuitive ability of just really, right, it's these decisions we make and these incremental advantages we try and gain, whether it's fouling the half, fouling in the situation for Yoli, and scheduling and recruiting analytics, and just in our hustle staff, just things that, as a whole program, holistically top down, we look for incremental advantages that kind of are outcome independent. It's process over results, outcome independent, plus expected value just here and there, and hope it all adds up and gives us 2% edge, 3% edge, or 1% edge. And over time, hopefully leads to more wins than losses. And he's fantastic about that, and understanding the fact that fouling Yoli means we still might lose. Ken was tremendous, and we'll get to it and breaking down the numbers, and it turns out we still lose in that situation over 23% of the time. So 1 out of 4 times, we're still going to lose the game. But 3 out of 4 times, we're going to win, and an extra couple percentage points goes a long way.
And it's a good point. And with fouling up 3, you're probably going to win the game regardless. And so you're just getting positive feedback over whatever decision that you do, basically. And with this stuff, especially, fouling tied or fouling 1, but fouling 2 as well, it will be, you'll lose more often, and it will be criticized more often. But so in that article, I'm going to switch over to Ken now. In that article, you guys wrote that the initial decision was, the quote is, a hunch based on some back of the envelope math. And in kind of thinking about this problem, I think we might have talked about this, Jonathan, it's a hard thing to like reason through the fouling up 2 or the fouling up 1. There's so many different scenarios that can happen if you choose to foul, that it's hard to just like think about it in your head and come up with which way is better. So methodology wise, Ken, you use play-by-play data, which is historical data from previous years. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have play-by-play data pretty much from every game since the 2010 season. So 11 seasons worth of data. And when we talked through this problem initially, we weren't sure exactly how we'd attack it, because obviously in the foul up 3 situation, you have a lot of cases where guys foul and a lot of cases where guys don't foul. And you can easily just compare the 2 from play-by-play, and boom, you're pretty much done, although you're not quite done, but you're close enough to get an idea. Whereas in this situation, obviously nobody's fouling. So you have to kind of, figure out how to use the play-by-play in a way that simulates fouling pretty much. And then obviously works through all the possibilities after you've fouled, what can happen in terms of making shots and obviously missing shots, getting an offensive rebound. Like there are, as we talked through it, there were a lot of parts that we had to tie together, but obviously you have to tie all those parts together if you want to come up with a reasonably accurate picture.
One thing that you did differently this time from the fouling up 3 was overtime, right? So in the past, you've treated overtime as a 50-50 proposition. And so how is that different this time? And like, I guess even the implications on being a favorite or an underdog in this whole thing.
Yeah. So first of all, the overtime thing is really a sticky issue because in the fouling up 3 thing, I just assumed you had a 50-50 chance in overtime, which worked well enough, but there's, certain issues when you're an underdog or a favorite that would invalidate that assumption. And in this case, it was a problem. It became like, going into this, we didn't know how we were going to deal with overtime. Actually, we just kind of like worked through it and got to this point where it's like, okay, but let's look at this case where you don't foul. Let's look at this case where you foul and the other team gets the offensive rebound. How often do you win in that case? And we just ran the numbers. And then ultimately we ended up realizing that in all these different cases, like your chance of winning in overtime is at the mercy of the play-by-play and kind of randomness. And in some cases you won in overtime 52% of the time, and other times you won 37% of the time, and that influenced the outcome of the results. And so we had to, go back and like set those things to be equal, so that no matter what strategy you picked, when you went to overtime, you ended up, having the same winning percentage, which is the fairest way to analyze it. As far as the underdog thing, yeah, there's that got complicated as well. I mean, I think initially we thought, the hunch was, being an underdog is going to make all these strategies more useful. And it's true, but, the reasons for that weren't entirely tied to overtime, but partly influenced by overtime. Basically, whether you foul or not, if you're up 2, you have a 75% chance of winning or around there. So if you end up going to overtime, as an underdog, you might have a 40% chance of winning. And obviously that's not what you want to do. So you better, if you're going to foul, which increases the chance of going to overtime a little bit, you better make up for that in terms of increasing your chance of winning in regulation by a lot. And Jonathan obviously outlined the reasons why that made sense in the BYU game. If BYU's going to hit a 3, then your chances of winning in regulation go down dramatically. So that's why, certainly in that case, being an underdog and playing a team that was a good 3-point shooting team really allowed that strategy to make more sense in that case.
Right, and if I'm allowed to interject here, that was part of the genesis of it as well, is that we'd had conversations and kind of had talked to Ken. I think we talked to you about it a bunch too, Jordan. Throughout the season, we play Gonzaga, we play St. Mary's, we play BYU, played Stanford last year, where we're the underdog. This upcoming year, we'll play Arkansas, hopefully Louisville, play at Nevada. We'll play games where we probably won't be favored, where we probably want to avoid overtime. Overtime is a losing proposition if you're the underdog, or potentially a losing proposition if you can avoid the extra 5 minutes. For example, I know we talked to Ken about it, or Ken referenced it in the article on his site about playing Gonzaga in the WCC tournament. If we were down by 2 or 1 or whatever the case may be, our decision making at the end of that game, if the situation presented itself, which it nearly did, would have been overtime averse. We didn't want 5 more minutes against the best team in the country. We'd rather take the 30% chance or 25, whatever a Khalil Shabazz or Jamari Bouye 3-point percentage shot down by 2, or if it's a 1-point game or a 2-point shot, to just outright win the game. Zero-sum result, either you win it or you lose it, but there's no coin flip or 35 or 40% probability of overtime chance on that last possession. And so that decision making definitely factored in, and kind of ultimately led to the conversations that I had with Ken about, let's get to the nitty gritty of the data on it, because when is it better to try and just totally avoid overtime? We don't want overtime against Gonzaga. We're okay. We don't necessarily want overtime against BYU. We're home. They're the favorite. We try and avoid it if we can. We definitely don't want it at Gonzaga or against Gonzaga on a neutral court when they're the number 1 team in the country.
For listeners that haven't read the article yet, first of all, go to kempom.com and look at it probably before listening to this conversation. But the graphs that you guys came up with at the end are really, really helpful for making what is kind of a complicated process into something that's pretty easy to visualize. And Jonathan, as you're talking about the different like whether or not you want to go to overtime and that type of thing, that's when talking to coaches about stuff like this, one of the biggest things that come up is like all these little things, like, well, what if our best player is fouled out, and so we're not gonna be able to defend in these situations, or whatever, or we're in foul trouble and whatever, all these little things. And so when looking at these graphs, my question here is, like, is it that those little things, is the NCAA average representative of being able to make decisions, or it goes back to the whole, like, this is a really hard thing to just think about and come up with answers. So how would you suggest like incorporating it for a coach?
I guess from my perspective, or from coaches' perspectives, we really try to go step by step, and Ken kind of outlined it here in this conversation. And we also outlined it, I think, pretty thoroughly throughout the article in terms of breaking down all potential variables, going as nitty-gritty and as deep as changing the offensive rebounding percentage based on the score. So we went back and looked at the historical data of offensive rebounding percentage on general free throw attempts, which I don't know, I don't remember off the top of my head. I have it written down, but I think it's 15%, maybe it's 12.5%. But then we adjusted it per score. So sub 30 seconds down by 1, it might be higher because you're ramming, you're playing football. They don't call any offensive foul. They don't call any rebounding fouls. It gets up to as high as 25%. And in our calculations, we accounted for that. We also accounted for the chance that in a 1-on-1, we took that number by half. We divide that number by 2 because in a 1-on-1, you might miss the first and then it's a live ball to rebound, but you might make the first and therefore there's only one chance for a rebound. So we kind of thoroughly outlined all those scenarios. And then in the article, we went back and looked at, Ken pulled the numbers for historical data on free throw attempts, your first shot versus second shot. And it's a pretty significant difference in the first shot versus second shot. Now, how that relates game to game is a great question. And I think Ken is a data scientist and strictly with the background he has would have a slightly different answer than a coach in the heat of the moment. If somebody is 1 for 5.
Yeah, you tell us first and then we'll go to Ken.
If somebody's 1 for 5, I think a coach would be more likely to pull the trigger on fouling, even if they're potentially a 75% free throw shooter, and the data might say not to because they're 1 for 5 that game, versus if they're 5 for 5, but the data says to do it because they're only a 40% free throw shooter. I think there's a human element that coaches are absolutely going to include, and that's just going to have to be a kind of the way I envision it is we take these charts and kind of take the win probability pregame and almost have a meeting before the game, identifying free throw shooters and situations. And kind of going presetting it. So that way it takes the in-game emotion out of it is probably optimal. But I know how coaches are in heat of the moment. They might not want to, or they might be more willing if the guy that has the ball has missed a couple. It's just the reality of it.
Yeah. So Ken, that was on my list of the probably the most important input for these charts is what the free throw percentage is, I think. Okay. And so identifying what the free throw shooter is, you mentioned this, Jonathan, but in the article it said that on your first free throw you shoot worse than on the second free throw, which I know is consistent with NBA studies as well. And so then do you look at career numbers? Do you look at season numbers? What do you think about that, Ken?
Right. So I think part of this kind of answers your question in terms of, hey, what about all the fine details? Should we just trust this chart?
Yeah.
Nothing else. And obviously you shouldn't. This chart's a baseline, but part of that baseline is that we did assume, if you just assume a player's career free throw percentage or their season free throw percentage, like you're probably overestimating their true skill a little bit, especially in the single bonus, because again, that first free throw, if they're a 70% free throw shooter, like in that first free throw, they're going to be 67% over the long term. Obviously, for that one shot, you don't know what's going to happen, but over the long term, they're going to be a little bit worse. And, whether you want to put stock in whether a guy's cold or hot during the game, I think that's a little risky. I think there's been more research to show maybe that the attempts matter more so, I guess, than how many you made. If you've been to the line 15 times in the game, like you're probably going to be better than a guy who's just coming off the bench, hasn't shot a free throw. So that's maybe a factor to consider, but certainly that dip in that first free throw makes these charts, I think, more conservative if you're just going by the season free throw percentage. Like you have a little bit of room for error if we're just going by Yoli Child. Yoli Child is a special case because, as Jonathan said, he was injured and hadn't shot very well this year. But for most guys, if you just go by their career free throw percentage and use it on this, like you're going to be pretty safe because their actual percentage on that first free throw, which is what you're hoping they miss, is going to be, significantly less.
Right. And then a couple key points there is that the single bonus, Jordan, you mentioned the free throw percentage being the most important factor. While that 100% is, I think the second most important factor is single bonus versus double bonus.
Yep. Because
in the single bonus with a 60% free throw shooter or whatever, 65, there's a 35, 40% chance they miss. And then there's an 80+% chance you get the rebound, which means there's a 30 or so percent chance that you fouling is just a turnover for the opponent, which is incredibly valuable. Also important to note that in the Yoli instance, and he's a terrific player, so it's just a great example because he's such a great player, but he is their best rebounder. so again, the third most important factor is probably the offensive rebounding percentage. And in this specific example, we were mitigating their best offensive rebounder, a terrific player in Yoeli Childs.
So to get even more specific here, I'm looking at the tied. So this is fouling when tied. So it's a tie game, and the biggest thing that jumps out on the graph is that the single bonus has a really big difference. There's a big space in the lines there, versus when you're up 2, whether or not you're in the single bonus, not that it doesn't make a difference, but it's not nearly as significant there. So can you guys kind of go through the 3 different scenarios and like what makes them unique, I guess, in terms of fouling up 2, fouling up 1, and tied?
I'll start just because when I broached kind of this topic, I think part of the natural pairing, and I think I'd like to think we hit it off, but it had a lot to do with the fact there was a coach perspective and then just a straight data perspective. And it's super intuitive to me. And I think there was some conversation that we had that kind of worked through it, but in that single bonus situation is in a tied single bonus situation is if it's a 60% free throw shooter, there's a 40% chance that you're then going from letting the opponent have the last shot and free rolling them overtime to flipping the script and you're getting the free roll for overtime. I think that's unbelievably important and potentially undervalued, or at least from a coach's mindset. And I think it was great to see the data kind of back that up. And so when I went into this, that I was thinking fouling tied was super not used enough, and also in the up 2 situations, I didn't know what to expect with up 1. Obviously, the up 1 data is a little bit messy, but that was kind of my pre-data assumptions. It was great to see the data back that up to varying degrees. Obviously, it's not a no-brainer. It's you're only increasing your expected win probability on the break-even chart by a few percentage points, which I think is a huge difference over the course of the season. But so that was kind of my perspective of it.
Yeah. So I think the reason for the differences in the lines in each situation is that what you care about at the end more than anything is whether you're leading or tied or losing. So, when you're up 2, it really hurts you if your opponent makes 2. And that's, obviously not any different whether it's single bonus or double bonus, in that situation. So that's why those lines are pretty close. And then obviously in the tied situation, it's, really to your benefit if they miss their, first free throw or, get 0 from their trip to the free throw line. That's obviously a lot more likely in the single bonus. So, if they just make 1 free throw, now you're trailing. And obviously that's all that matters when it comes to the outcome of the game. So whether they're up, whether they're up 1 or up 2 isn't as important as whether they're, the difference between being tied and up 1. And so that's why fouling in the double bonus when tied is really not viable, but fouling in the single bonus is a useful strategy, especially for the underdog.
A couple of things that come up in the foul up 3 debate that I think is relevant and probably something that is worth mentioning is this whole idea. I like to talk about it a lot, where just because you pick one of these options doesn't mean, or you choose to foul doesn't mean it's going to happen. Like your team has to execute it. But with this, because the percentage free throw shooter matters so much, let's say you tell your team to foul, and one of the best parts about the BYU and even the Pacific example was you were fouling with BYU. It was their primary creator, Yoeli Childs, and then with Pacific, it was their point guard. Let's say it's not quite as easy to foul this team, and you wind up fouling like an 85% free throw shooter. Would that be what's that going to do to your win probability here? Like, is there a downside to fouling if it's too good of a shooter?
Yes. Yes, there is. Yeah. I mean, that's always a hard part with these analyses. Probably Jonathan can speak more to the ability to, I call it like kind of almost, assuming that the game's like a video game, can you execute the strategy perfectly? Obviously in a foul up 3, that's part of the reason that the 2 strategies are so close, is that you can bungle that strategy pretty easily and you can get hosed by poor officiating. It seems like that would be less applicable here, especially, if it's the point guard who is the bad free throw shooter. I mean, that's really, I think, what you look for, but I don't know. Jonathan probably has a better handle on that than I would.
So I actually think, kind of as you said, that the bad officiating might hose you on up 3, you're actually kind of flipping the script officiating wise when you foul unconventionally 0 tied up 1 or up 2. 1, because you can tell the ref you're going to foul, or you can just play it out and tell your team or have a call for it, and the officials may not be expecting it, so they're not anticipating it, 1. But 2, you're also having an opportunity to get a steal. So that steal rate is really low. It's probably sub 5%, but there's a chance that you just get the ball and you either get the steal and and you get the turnover right away, or you get a fast break layup or whatever, depending on the time score situation that we didn't factor in, that I think you can't really factor in into the equation. But so yes, obviously fouling an 85% free throw shooter is not great, but you're extending the game too. So it's not necessarily the end of the world, because they still have to go and make 1 or 2, and then you get the ball. You also might get a steal. There's a bunch of different things that can still happen. So yes, it would decrease win probability because the numbers say so. But like we talked about kind of at the beginning, it might just be decreasing it, and the results still may favor you. But if you played it out 10 times, you might have lost 1 or whatever. There's a chance it's decreasing the win probability, but it still might work out in your favor.
And then the other foul up 3 related thing, which I've talked to you about before, Jonathan, is there's a big difference in defending up 2 or up 3 versus any of these scenarios, really. So up 3 defending, I think one of the reasons why in Ken's initial study on it, teams shoot 16% from 3 in his sample, right? And so as from a defense, I did a video on this where I pretty much stole Ken's data, but I did some of the X's and O's type stuff that was new, and I used Tom Izzo as an example. So Michigan State, they don't let you drive to the basket, right? They're in the gaps and they play very conservative off of the ball. They had a foul or defend situation where they were up 3 and their defense is completely different. They're focused on taking away the 3-point line. You would never see an Izzo team like that. The other thing teams do is they switch. So like the whole idea of 3-point defense, you don't control it, but only to the extent that because you don't want to give up a 2, right? And so that changes in the foul up 3 situations. In the up 2 situations, it's the complete opposite, because you don't want to lose the game on the 3. So now you're so worried about giving up the 3 because you don't want to lose the game that you're I don't know if you guys broke it down this like descriptively, but I'm sure like shots at the rim go way up in foul up 2 situations. And this would be baked into the math that you did, Ken. But yeah, am I onto something there?
Yeah, I mean, that's something worth looking at. I haven't looked at the specific case where you're up 2. I've looked at the case where you're up 3 and it's a longer possession, and it's not the last few seconds of the game, but the shot clock's off and there's 25 seconds left or something. And, invariably, if you're watching on TV, you hear the comment that, the team should go get the easy 2 in that situation. I've looked at that, and the easy 2 is not very easy. Like 2-point percentage is higher in that case, but it's like, 3 or 4% higher than in a normal situation. So yeah, it'd be interesting actually to dig in and see what the situation is up to. But obviously, as you point out, there's you can't discard the 3. There's significant risk giving up the 2, and so that's part of the reason why this works out.
And to Ken's point, and to your point, Jordan, your question, when we wrote back of the envelope math with regards to the decision to foul Yoli, which the purpose of this study and working with Ken on this is to kind of create something that's long form and evergreen and lasting for a while with the foul charts and things. So we keep going back to this one example just because it worked out well and it got attention and was the genesis for these discussions, but it's more so the long-term future use cases that we care about. But yes, the back of the envelope math to your question, Jordan, after the game with Director of Analytics, Jason Greenfield, Coach Golden, and myself, we broke down the percentages, not necessarily of shots at the rim or whatnot, but BYU scores at 1.2 points per possession, but that they don't score in every possession. They might score in 60% of the possession. So 60% of the time they're scoring either 2 or 3 points if we're not fouling them, which means we're either going to be tied or losing. And then 40% of the time, or whatever we determined it was, they're not going to score. So the only way they get 1 point is if we foul. Otherwise, they're either tied or winning or down 2.
that's like the biggest difference between when I had Todd on and he was going through expected value of the Pacific foul, which was at the end of the first half. You can pretty much do back of the envelope math for something like that. It's an expected value. It's a points per possession thing. Win probability is very difficult to do in your head, I think.
Right.
Yeah, there's a fixed number of, you know how many possessions there's going to be at the end of a half too. So that's part of the reason why that computation is simpler.
Yeah. Not as many options of what can happen.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Another, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate, but using Ken's old work against him a little bit. The 2-for-1, when you did 2-for-1, the findings there were like, yes, it is significant, but you don't get that many opportunities at it. It's reasonable to focus on other things. In this example, you had you directly calculated that BYU Yoli Childs example, and I think it was 2.6% increase in win probability. And so I want some context around that. Like coaches probably don't normally think of things in terms of 2.6% win probability. So is that like, how significant is that? How much should coaches care?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I should have mentioned the 2-for-1 thing in that piece. I think I forget what the added win probability was in that, but it was less than 1%, right? It was like fractions of 1%.
Yep.
And that is I definitely should have mentioned that. Yeah, now I'm kicking myself. I had thought about that. And so relative to that, it's huge. Like if people are crying about doing 2-for-1s, like you definitely should make a ruckus about doing this. On the flip side, I will say, like, if Jonathan coaches for 35 more years and does this one time a year, like he's going to see the net benefit of one win in his coaching career. Like, so when you put it that way, it's like, well, this isn't that significant. But I guess my defense would be that coaches are making those kind of decisions all the time. Like, think about structuring a practice plan or something.
Right.
Like how much win probability does that add over the course of the season? It adds, for the good coaches, it adds something. And it's, probably your biggest decision, whether to give a guy 5 more minutes of playing time or not. Another great example, like how much win probability does that add in a particular game? Like probably not 3%, for most cases. I mean, obvious cases, of course, but when you're choosing between 2 players who are really similar, like it doesn't make that much difference. So, so I guess that's how it's just one of many decisions that is kind of part of winning basketball games. And it's, as far as a singular decision, like pretty significant.
Right. Following up on Ken, 2.7%, I think, or 2.6% in the heat of the moment is huge. But as Ken said, it might happen one time a year. Now, I think if you're prepared for the situation, it probably happens a little bit more than we think. It probably happens 3 or 4 or 5, half dozen times a year. But you got to be ready. You have to have coached your guys, and as Ken said, spend practice time on it, prepare them for it. It's not just as easy as just Coach Golden sitting there shouting it out, having never discussed it before, with 22 seconds left, saying, "Hey, follow the point guard, follow the point guard." It's having a code for it and practicing it, and the guys understanding what we're doing and the rationale behind it. They also understand the full data. But what player wouldn't love to have, as a worst case scenario, a coach telling them, "Hey, worst case scenario here is you have the ball and a chance to win. Ball's in your hands. Go make a play." So you can easily make it a positive coaching relationship building thing as well.
Yeah, it's important to note too that, like, even though so it worked out for you guys, but we don't know what would have happened if you didn't foul. Like, it probably would have worked out that way too, right? It was nice in this case that it worked out really cleanly. Like,
exactly, and that's kind of what I was trying to say, is that the genesis or the purpose of reaching out to you and having these conversations and then eventually building a study out of it is to make it a long form thing that we can use, or that I can take with me and carry with me with each team I'm at for the rest of my career, or continuously and update the data set and keep expounding upon it. It has less to do with the individual example. The individual example just makes for a great talking point and reference, because you're right, it happened so cleanly and worked out so nicely, and the situation's aligned where we were the underdog. We followed them, missed the first one, got the rebound. The situation worked out textbook. I care most about, I'm forward looking, I care most about how this affects or impacts wins and losses in decision making moving forward, and that's where I think it can really help forever.
So Jordan, let's just play make believe here and assume we have a full season this year,
Yep.
or we can talk about next season or whatever. Whatever the next season is that gets played, do you think another coach will implement this strategy at any point during the season?
That's a good question. Yes, I do. And I feel like I have some anecdotal evidence here. So there's been private Zoom calls with groups of coaches. I mean, it's crazy how many there are. And these things are being talked about. I know that. I guess maybe not by in some cases there have been head coaches on these Zoom calls that are the ones that are going to fire away on the decision. But I can at least tell you that these are being talked about by coaches. And also, I asked the question about, is 3% or whatever it was, about 3% enough? But I agree. Even I asked it, for the sake of argument. But like in that article you brought up, foul or defend, or foul up 3, how it's going to be significantly smaller of a difference than these situations. So and then even like you mentioned, different decisions coaches make, having worked for staffs, and I'm sure Jonathan has these stories too. I mean, we would spend hours on what time we should practice tomorrow. I mean, actually hours. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that like 2 point whatever it was isn't enough personally. But
yeah, I've had a coach ask me when to schedule home games, as far as like time of day.
Time of day.
Yeah.
It might have been me. If there's a scheduling had, you let me know. If either any schedules to be had, or benefits that we can use or implement moving forward with regard to scheduling. There's nothing more difficult than trying to build a non-conference schedule for a team that wants to position themselves in the at-large conversation, and that's not a Power 5 week. So we're all ears, and we're willing to play anybody, anytime, any place, anywhere. If it's either a neutral court or has a home game attached, that's a public service announcement for anybody.
This is going to be the first ever podcast to get a game scheduled. I like it. I like it. Actually, I'm sure a head coach has gone on like Rothstein's before and done this.
but circling back to your point, Jordan, or Ken's question about will another coach do it?
Yeah. Yep.
I said at the beginning, and I reiterate it. I've been really fortunate with the staffs I've worked with. Coach Golden, I think Coach Smith would as well. Coach Golden deserves all the credit in the world. He's the one that has to execute it and pull the string. If Coach Smith wants to follow suit, he has to execute and pull the string. It's the head coach who has to do it. And having two coaches who are so risk-willing or data-driven and data-informed decision-making and looking to find such incremental edges throughout makes it an easy decision for them. And not everyone's like that. And hat tip to them, and they're awesome.
Well, what do you think, Ken? That you've been publishing stuff for a long time, and I would guess you're probably skeptical because your work has taken some time for implementation in the past. Is that?
I mean, yes, pretty much. The only thing that I have to compare it to is when I wrote the piece about the Ty Lawson move in an NBA game where you roll the ball inbounds and kill the clock or whatever, and there were like some like hints of UMBC doing that against Virginia, and I thought, oh, maybe they got that from me, and they probably didn't. They probably were just reacting in the moment. But I think it's tough because like this strategy is most useful for underdogs. So you'd think on the one hand, like they're willing to try kind of unconventional strategy, but at the same time, if it blows up in your face, it's also likely to cause problems maybe with your players. And so underdogs are probably more likely to have, players who are maybe, not completely bought in than others. Like, I don't know. So I think that is a possible thing holding us back. I think it's great that like Todd and Jonathan have been so forthcoming about the strategy and putting it out there. And so awareness might lead to one more instance of this. That's what I'll predict. And when that happens, I'll be glad to publicize it for whoever does it.
Well, I need to follow up on that because part of the push to reach out, partner with Ken, I have to give some credit to Preston Johnson of ESPN, who followed us in Vegas and took a keen affection for the analytics that we were using. He's on record. I think he tweeted it out or posted about it. saying that he thinks every team, I think he's crazy, but he thinks every team should be, or he said should be, but he also thinks will be printing out and or using these charts and making these types of decisions at the end of games within 10 years. Obviously, a decade's a long time, but if there's some sort of content.
I hope we have iPads on the bench by then.
Regardless, Preston is an advocator for this study and believes that teams will be catching on sooner rather than later, and maybe it happens exponentially at a certain point, but probably not in year one, according to your guys' responses.
The problem is in 10 years, the single bonus will probably not be in existence, so the strategy will be less likely to be used. We need immediate action.
Fair point.
If you can include the end of half fouling in it, I would be willing to put a pretty good bet on at least someone doing the end of half fouling. If I can group it together, I'd feel pretty confident. But it only takes one with this up to or tied thing. And even looking at your mentions, Ken, when you tweeted, there were some European coaches saying we've been doing this.
Right.
So.
And Jordan, that goes to the end of half thing, like we did against Gonzaga in the WCC semifinals, where we fouled Killian Tilly in the single bonus. He's a 70% free throw shooter, I believe. And he made the first and missed the second, gave them 1 point. And we went down, and Charles Midland got fouled and made one. So it was a 1-1 trade. But we were getting ourselves a 65% free throw shooter who got 2 shots, and they had a 70% free throw shooter in the 1-on-1. We'll take that trade, the expected value of that any day of the week. It was just great, hilarious that Dickie V said, "Oh, got to know time and score. What are you doing?"
Oh, yeah. I remember that now.
So the end of half fouling only really happened twice. So a team might say they want to do it, but the situation has to present themselves, single bonus, bad free throw shooter in the moment. There are a lot of factors at play. I would take the over on how many teams talk about wanting to do it. I'd have to see what the line is and how many teams actually execute it. But I think it'll be in people's conscious and minds, whether it's end of half or end of game situations, and I think it'll happen a little bit more than the two of you seem to pessimistically think.
End of half is a no-brainer. The qualifications for fouling at end of half are much looser. You don't need a bad free throw shooter. You don't really even need single bonus.
And it's not an immediate zero-sum result of winning and losing.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. And look, again, I'll say it one more time, but like people are definitely asking about this, which maybe they were doing with the stuff that still took a while to be implemented. I don't know, but I know that coaches are asking about this.
Well, I mean, just think about the Fallout 3 study like that, The reason I haven't updated that in 6 years, like this is the pessimistic side of me talking, but the reason I haven't updated that in 6 years is because like it literally influenced nobody. Like, if you were for it, you're still
YouTube
for
video about it.
I know. I mean, it influenced you, but I'm talking about coaches and the vast majority of commentators.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair point. It makes sense to me that we're a little bit more optimistic.
Actually, I'll take whatever overs you want to set, because I know maybe not this year, but as soon as Kevin Hovde becomes a head coach, he'll be implementing these strategies. I know Mike Magpie at Riverside will be implementing these strategies. I think Kyle Smith already has or will start to. So the Kyle Smith, Todd Golden tree, as it expands, will also help boost those numbers and the speed. The faster that tree continues to grow, the more head coaches that will be making decisions analytically data informed, such as these.
Washington State seems like the logical next target, I guess, for this to happen. But I'm rooting for it. I'm hopeful. But I've been doing this for 15 years. I'm a little more realistic. But I think it's possible. Like I'm not, completely shutting the door to it.
All right. So I did not prep you guys for this, but I do have one other thing quickly I want to talk about. And it's for Ken, but John, feel free to chime in too, is a ranking system with no non-conference games, if that were to happen.
Yes.
I almost, even before you guys published this article, I almost wanted to have you on a podcast, Ken, to talk about that. But I don't want to keep you guys here forever, but a ranking. So I have no inside information, but let's assume that there was whatever. There's no non-conference basketball next year, and only conference games are playing. If the listener thinks about it from Ken's system, which ranks all 353 teams, how is that now affected?
Yeah, so that's funny you mentioned that because I've been preparing something on my blog for it if it does come to that, and actually ran a prototype a couple nights ago. But obviously there's a problem where the teams are not connected. So you can't just run a system the way I do now and know, how good Gonzaga is relative to Duke because they haven't played any common opponents or their opponents haven't played any common opponents. So you're in the dark on that. But what I did was basically take the preseason ratings, take the average for each conference and use that as the baseline for each conference that would play, and then your ranking is relative to your conference, but obviously your conference is relative to other conferences. And conference ratings are really stable. So as it turns out, I ran it for 2 seasons ago, and it worked pretty well. Like you compare pretend like 2 seasons ago nobody played non-conference games, and just rate teams based on that, the method I just described, and actually the top 9 were the same top 9 as actually occurred, like not in the same order, but you had the same top 9 teams, and there weren't too many outliers. The one issue was like Wofford was ranked a lot lower just because the Southern Conference ended up being a lot better that year based on their non-conference play than you would have expected heading into the season. So it hurt them a bit, but for the most part, you can create a really viable system. It's not perfect. It's not great. It's not what you'd want. You'd want non-conference games, but given the situation that you're dealt, like it's kind of like disappointing hearing the NCAA guys talk about how they're just going to resort to the eye test or whatever. Like you don't need to resort to the eye test. You can have a pretty good system just using the method I just described.
So I was going to mention the eye test. The eye test is it's also affected by only non-conference games, right? You don't get to watch teams playing against it's like, I don't know how you can watch only WCC games and then have a feeling for how the WCC compares to, as someone who, half of Hoop Vision is X's and O's, I'm pretty anti-eye test when it comes to the selection committee. But your rankings are predictive, and that might not be the best fit for the NCAA. So selection, or for the tournament. So selection wise, I think it's more of a challenge, maybe the lack of.
You can still do wins above bubble. Obviously you have fewer games, but I guess what I'm saying is like that. That's how the net system would work too, right? Like you're just establishing that baseline for how good your wins are, and you could pretty much use that. That system basically will still properly value wins, like it would in any other year. So. Yeah, obviously you wouldn't use that for selection, but you could certainly use it as a baseline for. I mean, that's the thing that would have to happen. You would have to use wins above bubble, right? You couldn't go on top 50 wins or top 100 wins because
you don't have the opportunity.
The champion of the Southern Conference, doesn't get that. Stephen F. Austin doesn't get that. So, so you would have to go to a wins above bubble system, which I realize the NCAA is probably not interested in doing, but that would be the fairest thing to do, and I think it would work just fine.
Yeah, so one thing in general with the NCAA selection committee that I've always been kind of critical of is the lack of transparency, and it's very ambiguous in terms of how they're picking teams from year to year. It's, just they can kind of pick the teams and then figure out the rationale from there. And so to me, the whether it's wins above bubble or whatever the system is, as long as ahead of time, you're actually aware of what the system is, that's the solution to this is, it's no way is perfectly fair, especially when you're not in control of your schedule, and playing conference games. But that's what I would push for, is just clearly stated. Like the example I used the other day with my dad, who's a big high school basketball fan, is in New York State, the league I played in, it's a pretty bad system that they have. Like it's a point system, but it's a system and everyone knows what the system is. And so it's 2 points if you play a team from this classification, and 4 points, and it's defined. And I mean, that's what the NCAA should be trying to do regardless. Maybe this would help pull them in that direction in the future, but I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the one thing about this whole, the pandemic is that it has exposed like a lot of problems with a lot of systems. And I think it's, if it comes to a situation where we're playing half a season or whatever, even if there's a few non-conference games, it's going to expose how kind of unfair, illogical the selection system is, and maybe there'll be some big changes. Maybe we can get some positives out of this. I don't know, but yeah, it's certainly, this is of any year in the past, like this is the year where you need like a really kind of good method. When you're playing 30 games, like it really doesn't matter too much what method you're using. You know who the top teams are. You know who the top 20 teams are. So like. But this year it's going to be a lot different if the schedule's impacted. Like you're not going to be able to know that easily. And if we end up just resorting to the eye test, it's going to be a really lost opportunity, I think.
And for the record, Jonathan's former boss now, Kyle Smith, is the coach who is quoted that there shouldn't be a committee. That I think he on my podcast he said something like LeBron James wins the eye test every time, right? Like, and so yeah, your bosses are progressive, Jonathan, I guess in general.
For sure. We talked about we're trying to remain as optimistic as possible with regards to non-conference, but even if we resort to something where it's just local non-conference, let's play Cal, let's play Stanford, let's play UC Davis, let's play Sac State, USC, UCLA, Bakersfield, Northridge, Riverside, Fresno State. Let's play all the California schools and bus around to give our team. It's about the experience with student athletes first and foremost, give them as many games as possible as part of their college time, but also with regards to the money making that is the NCAA tournament, to give it the selection committee. So we do have a committee, as many opportunities and make it as fair as possible. And that would give some sort of cross references for statistical databases and historical norms and things of that nature, however it may be that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, I don't even really want to speculate about what's going to happen. But it's an interesting analytics question for sure, and selection process. And for one more rant on the eye test, because I do like ranting about
get it all out.
Yeah. It's if you watch a team when they win, they look good. If you watch a team when they lose, they look bad. It's like, if only there was results that proved what this happened. Like, let's say I don't know, one year like Davidson is on the bubble and they run beautiful motion offense, right? It's like, should they be penalized for that? Maybe that they're not winning more with this beautiful, like, I don't understand how the eye test comes into play here. But yeah, that's my rant.
I mean, it goes back to, I remember maybe almost probably a half dozen years ago now, when I asked Jordan, like, just find me the stat that correlates most to winning, especially the college level. Like, is it effective field goal percentage, what four factor? Like, I know the four factors all have different percentages towards winning. And he said the bottom line is just more offensive and defensive efficiency. Well, find a way to get good at both of those. Doesn't matter how pretty they are stylistically. The Richmond, the Princeton offense, the backdoor cuts, pace and space, Virginia ball. Doesn't matter. Find a way to improve the efficiency of your offense and or your defense. Ideally, both. You'll be pretty good, and regardless of what the eye test says.
That's all that should matter.
Yeah, and. Yeah, well, that's that. Yes. But I appreciate it. KenPom.com to check out the study, the graphs especially. I think every coach listening to this should take a look, and let us know on Twitter if you work for a team or anything like that and are going to be implementing this stuff. Maybe those coaches will keep it private, but since we did have that discussion on how it will spread, give us some feedback if you're willing to.
Part of, like you said, keep it private. Sure, your team might want to keep their strategy private, but whether the opponent knows it or not, they still can't stop them from doing it. And if you intuitively or inherently or subconsciously know that the opponent might do that, you might change who you play at the end of the game. So now we might not be able to make that strategy, but now you're not playing who you want to play. So we've already added some sort of expected value and efficiency to that end of game decision making that isn't accounted for.
Yeah.
So sure, keep it private, keep your edges to yourself, yes, but also you might know it's coming, you can't stop it.
That was a foul up 3 thing that like teams kind of freak out when they know that they're going to be fouled. That it's sort of related to what you just said, sort of not. But yeah, if teams are now sitting out a poor foul shooter or something, it does change everything a little bit. And I do agree, these in-game decision-making things, it's probably not the win probability is there. So
Right.
versus other secrets, I guess it's definitely not lower on the list.
Right. It's public and it happens so quickly. The coaches be willing to make the decision on the fly and go with it.
Well, thank you both again. Actually, there has been other repeat Solving Basketball guests, but I think you're one of the second and third for repeats. So thank you both for coming back on, and yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Burbs.
No hand checking. Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, Tony Kukoc.